In the history of war, there are names that cannot be spoken without a pause in the heart. Aleksei Petrovich Maresyev is one of them. A man who endured the impossible. A pilot who lost his legs, yet returned to the sky to strike the enemy again. His life began like that of thousands of boys in the Soviet Union. The dusty streets of provincial Kamyshin, the noisy markets, the smell of freshly baked bread. Dreams of the sky were born not in wealthy families, but in creaky courtyards where boys chased a ball and caught clouds with their eyes. But fate had prepared for him a path that seemed not only difficult, but deadly. In the winter of 1942, he would find himself alone in deep forests, with shattered legs, no food, and almost no hope. The frost would bite his skin to blood, the snow would crunch under each desperate step. Anyone else would have given up. But he walked, day after day, step by step. This is not just a story of survival. It is the tale of a man who refused to die, because he knew a place in the sky awaited him, and in his soul burned a duty to fulfill to the very end. And his feat became a symbol that a human can defeat even his own body if the will to live and fight burns within. Aleksei Petrovich Maresyev was born in early spring of 1922 in the small Volga town of Kamyshin. At that time, Kamyshin was not yet known for its factories and wide avenues. It was a provincial settlement stretched along the great river, with wooden houses painted in faded colors and narrow streets that in spring drowned in mud and in summer filled with dust. The Maresyev family lived modestly. His father worked at a local enterprise, his mother kept the house and raised the children. There was nothing excessive in their home. Old furniture, a few photographs on the walls, worn books that Aleksei loved to leaf through before he could even read. But there was always order and warmth. In winter, the stove smoked so that the scent of wood seeped into clothes. And in the evenings, the lamp lit the table where the family gathered for supper. Childhood in Kamyshin was simple, but not easy. Boys played war games, ran through empty lots, and in winter rode homemade sleds. Sometimes they climbed the high banks of the Volga and watched as cargo barges slid slowly along the water, with black smoke trailing from steamships in the distance. Young Alyosha could stand for hours, gazing at the horizon, dreaming of distant lands and adventures. At school, he was not a top student. Teachers remembered him as stubborn, restless, always in a hurry. He loved physical education, ran well, swam well, and especially enjoyed climbing trees. From early on, he had a thirst for movement and freedom. He also had a special fascination for machines and airplanes. In the early 1930s, airplanes sometimes appeared in the sky over Kamyshin, a rare and mesmerizing sight. Children would drop everything and run to an empty field to watch the silver speck slowly turn into a winged machine. One day, when Aleksei was still in primary school, an agitation squadron flew into town. It was a real sensation. Tents were set up in the square, aviation models and tools were displayed, and photographs of pilots were shown. It was then that the thought first took root in Alyosha's mind. He too would be a pilot. Not just a dreamer who looked at the sky, but someone who would rise into it himself. The path to this dream was not easy. The family lacked money, and the boy's health sometimes faltered. He often caught colds, but none of these obstacles stopped him. He began attending the school's aero club and read everything he could find about aviation. In Kamyshin's library, he would sit for hours over issues of Wings of the Soviets, studying airplane diagrams and memorizing the names of famous pilots. These were the years of industrialization, and even in provincial towns, changes were felt. The streets began to see the first trucks, and radio broadcasts more often carried news of Soviet pilots' records. For boys like Aleksei, this was fuel for the dream. He saw pilots as the heroes of a new age, as brave as the epic warriors of old, but armed not with swords, but with machines that could soar above the clouds. When he turned 15, he knew with certainty that he would tie his life to aviation. He began training his endurance, running in the mornings, hardening himself in cold water. This was not just a hobby, but preparation for the profession he spoke of with such confidence that those around him believed him without question. These early years in Kamyshin, with the smell of the river wind, the noise of the marketplace, and the distant hum of airplanes, shaped his character. Here he learned never to give up, to believe in himself, and to pursue his goal even if the path seemed impossible. And ahead, the second half of the 1930s in the Soviet Union was a time of rapid change. Industrialization swept across the country. Factories were being built, new railways laid, and more airplanes were taking to the skies. For a teenager from provincial Kamyshin, this was a true window into the wider world. Aleksei often heard on the radio the names of Valery Chkalov, Mikhail Gromov, Mikhail Vodopyanov. These men became symbols of the new era, examples of courage and technical progress. In school, wall newspapers appeared photographs of pilots in fur helmets and goggles. And in shop classes, boys built wooden airplane models. Every such activity was for Aleksei a small step toward his dream. At 15, he entered a trade school to learn a working profession. Studies came easily to him, especially anything related to mechanics and metalwork. He understood that a pilot not only had to be able to fly an airplane, but also to know its design. He absorbed this knowledge eagerly, dismantling old engines and repairing bicycles for neighbors. It was during these years that he began attending the local aero club. This was the most important decision of his youth. The Kamyshin Aero Club became his second school, but one far more thrilling. Instructors taught future pilots the theory of flight, navigation, and the basics of meteorology. At first, he sat at a desk, drawing course lines and wind charts in pencil. Then, for the first time, he sat at the controls of a training glider. That moment stayed with him for life. The quiet whistle of the wind, the slight tremor of the wings, the feeling that the earth was slowly falling away, and ahead there was only the sky. But the road to a full-fledged flight school was hard. To enroll, one had to pass strict exams and a medical commission. The medical check was the most nerve-wracking stage. In those years, the health standards for pilots were uncompromising. Any deviation could be a reason for rejection. Aleksei prepared for this test as an athlete prepares for a major competition. He kept running in the mornings, swimming in cold water, and pedaling his bicycle for long hours to strengthen his legs. Soon, fate offered him a chance. A traveling commission arrived in town to recruit cadets for the Chkalov Military Aviation School, one of the most prestigious in the country. Signing up for the interview, Aleksei felt he was on the threshold of change. He passed the tests for vision, hearing, and coordination, and answered theoretical questions on physics and geometry. And when the doctor signed his medical card, he knew the road to aviation was open. In the late 1930s, he left his native Kamyshin and set out to study. For him, this was not just a journey to another city. It was the first step beyond the familiar world, beyond the quiet streets, the scent of the Volga, and the chatter of the marketplace. Now he was headed for a life where everything would be devoted to one goal: to become a true military pilot. Training at the aviation school was far harder than he had imagined. Mistakes were not forgiven. Every flight was followed by a debriefing. Every movement of the control stick had to be precise. Cadets learned to navigate by compass, determine wind speed, and read maps. At night, they memorized instructions and diagrams, falling asleep over textbooks in the barracks. But none of this frightened Aleksei. On the contrary, he felt his dream becoming reality. Every hour in the air strengthened his conviction that he had chosen his path well. And although war loomed ever closer, like thunderclouds before a storm, he thought not of fear, but of the importance of being ready to fly when the moment came. The summer of 1941 began with ominous news. Tension was in the air, but no one fully believed that war would break out so suddenly. At the aviation school where Aleksei was training, cadets were already used to intense drills and constant marches. But the morning of June 22nd changed everything. The radio broadcast the announcement of Germany's attack on the Soviet Union. Silence fell in the barracks. Molotov's words over the loudspeaker seemed unreal. But within hours, preparations began. The cadets knew their training was ending. The war needed pilots immediately. Aleksei received his assignment to a combat unit. Along with other young pilots, he headed west toward the front. The journey was long, the trains slow, often stopping. At stations they saw trains with wounded soldiers, trains with refugees, columns of troops. All illusions vanished. The country was burning. His first days at the front were a blur of feverish activity. Setting up the airfield, checking equipment, receiving combat orders. The sky over the front was no longer peaceful. It roared with engines, cracked with gunfire, flashed with tracers. Aleksei saw the enemy in the air for the first time. And he understood instantly that training flights had been only preparation for this. The fight where life itself was at stake. The first mission remained etched in his memory. The weather was clear, but his chest was tight. The order was simple: reconnaissance and cover for ground forces. With his wingman, he climbed into the sky. Below stretched forests and fields, a river glittered in the distance. But behind the calm view lurked danger. From the west came a formation of enemy aircraft. The engagement came fast, the air filled with the harsh roar and sharp pops of gunfire. Everything seemed in slow motion. Turn, aim, burst. Aleksei saw one Messerschmitt spiral down, trailing smoke. But there was no time to rejoice. A second attack came from above. These first battles hardened him. He learned that fear could be suppressed by action. Every second in the air demanded focus. Every decision could be the last. After landing, his hands shook, but inside grew confidence. He was now part of the vast war, and his place was in the cockpit of a combat aircraft. By autumn of 1941, the front was retreating ever further east. Airfields had to be relocated, often in makeshift conditions. Pilots lived in dugouts, ate cold rations, slept in their clothes. Yet despite the fatigue and cold, each flight was full of resolve. They knew that behind them lay their cities, families, childhood. And they could not allow the enemy to advance further. These months became Aleksei's school of survival. He learned to maneuver so the enemy could not aim. He studied the habits of German pilots, knowing where they were strong and where they were vulnerable. Gradually, he stopped feeling like a novice. Now he was a combat pilot, ready to meet the enemy face to face. The spring of 1942 on the front was deceptively quiet. Snow still lay in the forests, but the roads were already turning to mud. At the airfield where Aleksei Maresyev served, everyone understood that the enemy was preparing new strikes. Raids on positions and reconnaissance flights took place almost daily. In early April, command received orders for a combat mission deep in enemy-held territory. The task seemed almost suicidal: to intercept a group of German aircraft covering a column of vehicles. Several fighters were assigned, including Aleksei's. The morning began with a cutting wind. Engines warmed on the runway. Mechanics checked every bolt, every hose. The pilots were silent. At such moments, words were unnecessary. Everything had been said in briefings and in the silence before takeoff. The launch was quick. The planes turned east and climbed. Soon dark dots appeared on the horizon. It was the enemy formation. The closing came fast. The Germans' first attack was sharp and well coordinated. Tracers stitched the air. Sparks from hits flashed past the cockpit. Aleksei rolled into a maneuver, avoiding aimed fire, and opened his own. An enemy fighter spun down, but the others did not retreat. The battle twisted into tight turns. The roar of engines, short bursts, sharp pulls on the stick, all merged into one stream. Every move was at the limit of human capacity. At one moment, Aleksei spotted an enemy aircraft lining up on his leader's tail. He turned sharply, fired a long burst, and took the attacker down. But in that instant, another Messerschmitt came up on him. A burst ripped through the fuselage. The cockpit filled with the smell of burning. The instrument panels sparked. A bullet struck his leg. The pain was sharp, but he kept control of the machine. The engine began losing power. Another burst struck the wing. Aleksei knew he would not reach the airfield. His only chance was to land in enemy territory. He chose a clearing in the forest and brought the plane down. The landing was hard. The landing gear collapsed, the machine plowed the ground and stopped in brush. The silence after the engine's roar was deafening. The smell of smoke and hot metal hit his nose. He tried to stand, but the pain in his legs was unbearable. The left leg was badly damaged. The right would not bend. He knew he was now in the most dangerous position. Around him, occupied territory. At any moment, German soldiers or local police could appear, and he could barely move. Gathering his remaining strength, Aleksei climbed out of the cockpit, took his pistol and some food from the emergency kit. He knew no help would come here. He would have to find his way back on his own. Around him lay the early spring silence. Somewhere in the distance there was gunfire, but here in the forest there was deceptive calm. And ahead began the journey that would become legend. The forest around was quiet, but the quiet was deceptive. Behind any pine could lurk the enemy, and Aleksei knew his life hung by a thread. The pain in his legs grew worse with every hour. The left leg was shattered, the right would not bend. Every movement sent a burning wave through his body. He surveyed the crash site. The plane stood in the forest, its fuselage pierced, one wing half torn away. Smoke still drifted in a thin column into the sky. That meant it could be spotted from the air. Staying near it was deadly. Taking his pistol, canteen, a piece of bread, and a map, Aleksei began to move. Move, the word was too generous. He crawled, clutching at tree roots, pulling himself forward with his arms. Every meter cost incredible effort. Snow still lay in the shadows of the spruces, biting his body with cold. Night frost froze his wounds, and daytime sun turned the snow to icy slush. He knew he had to head east toward the front line, but in the forest it was hard to navigate. At times he moved almost blindly, guided by the sun and rare openings in the canopy. Sometimes he froze for long minutes when voices or snapping branches sounded nearby. The enemy was close. The first day he lived on the remains of food taken from the cockpit. The second, he began searching the forest. Tree bark, young shoots, frozen berries. He knew his strength would fade faster than the distance to his own lines. But stopping was not an option. By day he crawled, by night he hid under fallen trunks, covering himself with branches. In those moments, the sky above seemed endless, the stars cold and indifferent. The wind carried the smell of smoke. Dogs barked somewhere far away. Every sound was a reminder the enemy was near. By the third day, the wounds began to fester. Fever blurred the line between dream and waking. He imagined himself back in Kamyshin, running along the Volga's bank, hearing his mother's voice. But the pain brought him back to reality. Every morning, he awoke with one thought: crawl further. One day he came to a clearing. Fresh tracks of wheels and boots marked it. It might lead to a village or straight into enemy hands. He decided. Moving slowly and cautiously, he chose a direction and continued. Strength was nearly gone. Sometimes he fell asleep on the snow, waking from the cold. His hands were scraped raw, his clothes soaked with mud. Every breath was a struggle, but he kept going, crawling, living. On the seventh day, he felt he could go no further. He lay on his back, staring at the sky, and for the first time allowed himself to think that perhaps the end was near. Then he heard a distant chopping sound, an axe. The sound gave him strength. People were near. The question was, whose? He gathered the last of his will and headed toward the sound. Every meter was agony, but he crawled as if into his final battle. Soon, a roof appeared between the trees. Aleksei, hardly believing his eyes, kept moving until he collapsed at the edge of the village. After that, everything was a blur. Shouts, faces, hands lifting him. He lost consciousness, but knew now he was in the hands of people who could save him. When Aleksei regained consciousness, he saw a wooden ceiling above him. The air was heavy, smelling of stove smoke, medicine, and something sickly sweet that made his head swim. He tried to rise, but his body felt filled with lead. His legs did not respond. A woman in a headscarf leaned over him. Her face was tired, but her gaze kind. She told him he was in a village house, that locals had found him and brought him here at great risk. He was in enemy territory, and help from his own could come only through a miracle. His wounds were severe. His legs were swollen, the skin around the cuts black from frostbite and gangrene. The woman fed him broth and gave him water, but it only kept his weak breath going. With each day, the pain sharpened and the fever rose. He knew that without surgeons, he would not survive. A few days later, partisans operating in the area arranged to get him across the front line. It was dangerous. They hid him in a sleigh, covered him with hay, and set off at night when the moon was hidden by clouds. The journey was long. The horses stepped quietly. The snow creaked under the runners. Artillery rumbled faintly in the distance. When he next opened his eyes, he was in a Red Army field hospital. The lamp's light stung his eyes. Around him were the groans of the wounded, the steps of nurses, the short commands of doctors. The smell of iodine and carbolic acid filled his nose. He tried to move his legs and realized he could not feel them. Not because they were frozen or in pain, but because they were simply gone. The surgeon, tall and gray-haired, sat beside him. His voice was even, but carried the fatigue of someone who had said this to dozens before. He explained that amputation had been the only way to save his life. Frostbite and gangrene had gone too far. If they had left the legs, he would have died within hours. In that moment, the world shrank to a point. All the years of dreaming about the sky, all the hours at the controls, all the plans collapsed. For a pilot, the loss of legs was not just an injury, it was a sentence. He lay silently, staring at the ceiling, fists clenched. The days dragged endlessly. He learned to sit, then to stand on crutches. The wounds ached, the stumps throbbed with every movement. But the pain was not only physical. Inside burned the thought that now he was useless, that his life was essentially over. Yet there were those who kept him from sinking into darkness. The nurses who patiently dressed his wounds, brought newspapers, and told the latest news from the front. The man in the next bed, an artilleryman with a bandaged arm, joked that they were now almost new and would still walk together on Red Square. And there were letters, from home, from his mother, from friends. In each one was the same phrase: "Wait, you will stand again." It was then that a thought took root in him, one that would become a goal. If he could stand, he would return to the sky, even if everyone around said it was impossible. Spring in the hospital moved at its own pace. Snow melted outside the windows, the smell of damp earth drifted in. But for Aleksei, it all seemed behind glass. His world had shrunk to a bed, crutches, and the long corridors of the clinic. Each day began with dressings and ended with attempts to make his body work without what had once seemed inseparable. At first, he could not bear to look at himself. Legs cut to the knee were wrapped in bandages, and each dressing table felt like an execution block. But time did its work. He began to see it not as an end, but as a challenge. If life had left him a chance, he had to use it fully. The hospital received a shipment of prosthetics. They were crude, heavy, metal, with leather straps that rubbed the skin raw. The rehabilitation doctor told him simply, "Learn to walk on them and you can live." And Aleksei answered to himself, "I will learn to run, I will learn to jump, and one day I will return to a cockpit." The first training sessions were torture. He would stand, grip the bar, and take a step. The metal joint of the prosthesis creaked, the straps bit into his body, his muscles burned. After 10 steps, he would fall in exhaustion, drenched in sweat. But the next day he stood up again. The doctor saw his persistence and began giving him extra exercises. Walking upstairs, squats, carrying weights. At times, it seemed his body would give up. At night, pain kept him awake, but he only clenched his teeth harder. He knew that without this work, he would be confined to bed forever. Rumors spread through the hospital about him. Fellow patients said that this pilot planned to return to active duty, even without legs. Some smirked, some tapped their temples. But there were those who believed. They encouraged him, brought fresh newspapers, told him about the Red Army's victories. Within a few weeks, he could walk down the corridor unaided. It was a small victory, but for him, it meant more than his first flight once had. He began to go outside. The spring air filled his lungs, and in the distance, beyond the hospital walls, he heard the drone of engines. Somewhere up there, real life was happening. One day he asked the doctor to let him try running. The doctor only shook his head. But Aleksei took a few steps faster than usual and felt his heart beat in the same rhythm it once did before takeoff. It was a sign he was on the right path. Now he lived with one thought: to return. Not just to stand on his feet, but to prove to himself and to everyone that he could fly again. And inside, a plan was already forming on how to pass the medical commission that was supposed to reject him forever. The summer of 1942 brought new waves of wounded to the hospital. Some returned to the front after recovery, others went to the rear. Aleksei watched this with a special feeling. His comrades were back in cockpits while he was still a patient. But in his mind, the plan was already clear. He knew the medical commission would not clear him for flight. The rules were strict, and the loss of both legs automatically ended a pilot's career. But he decided not to ask for exceptions. He would prove he could meet all the requirements like any other pilot. The first step was physical training. He trained every day as if preparing for exams, climbing stairs with weight, coordination exercises, practicing quick turns and falls. The prosthetics were no longer a heavy burden. They had become part of his body. One day, he asked the hospital commander for permission to take training flights. At first, the commander thought it was a joke. But seeing Aleksei's serious gaze, he said he would try to speak to the higher command. Soon, the answer came. He would be allowed to undergo testing at a flight school, but only as an experiment. The commission consisted of doctors and instructors. The first day they tested his general physical fitness. He ran on the track, did pull-ups, and jumped from a standstill. The creak of the prosthetics and the tight strap on his thigh did not stop him from outperforming some able-bodied candidates. The next day came the test in the air. He was given a training aircraft. The first seconds in the cockpit were special. The smell of oil, the cold metal under his palms, the gentle vibration of the engine. It was like coming home. He executed takeoff flawlessly, turned, performed several aerobatic maneuvers, and landed smoothly. The instructors exchanged glances, and there was no doubt in their eyes that this was a true pilot. The most difficult test was the mock dogfight. His wingman played the role of the enemy. Aleksei flew so precisely that he got on the enemy's tail and scored a conditional kill within 2 minutes of the start. This victory was not only in the air, but within himself. When the commission met, the chief doctor said he had never seen such willpower. And although they were formally breaking regulations, he signed the clearance for flight. Aleksei left the office with the document in hand, feeling he had regained the right to live. Soon, he was assigned to an aviation unit, where he was met with respect and curiosity. Pilots came up, asking if it was true he flew with prosthetics. He would only smile and say that, in the air, everyone is equal. Now, a new chapter of the war awaited him. Flying at the front without legs, with the same drive and the same duty to his country. But deep down, he knew he had not defeated the commission. He had defeated the impossible. The autumn of 1942 found Aleksei in an active combat unit. The airfield was on the edge of a small settlement, close to the front line. Only a few dozen kilometers separated them from the fighting, and every morning the sky was already humming with engines. For many pilots, his arrival was a surprise. Rumors of a pilot without legs had spread through the Air Force, but to see with their own eyes a man who had not only returned, but was ready to fight again, was something else. Aleksei carried himself calmly, without emphasizing his story. He simply did his job. His first combat sortie after returning was set for dawn. The air was cold and dry, frost lay silver on the grass. He took his place in the cockpit, checked the instruments, gripped the control stick. The prosthetics were strapped in to prevent slipping, and he was used to their weight. Takeoff was confident. The aircraft climbed smoothly. The engine droned steadily. With 2 other fighters, he headed for an area where reconnaissance reported a group of German bombers. The sun was just rising, painting the clouds orange, but dark specks were already visible ahead. Contact came quickly. His wingman signaled, and they split, attacking from different angles. Aleksei chose his target, a bomber flying slightly below the rest. He closed from behind, aimed, and fired a long burst. Flames burst from the enemy's engine, and the aircraft began to lose altitude. But immediately, an escort fighter closed on him. A burst flashed dangerously close, the cockpit lit by tracers. Aleksei swerved sharply into a turn, feeling the pull of inertia. The prosthetics held firmly, but each sharp maneuver demanded his full concentration. The battle dragged on. He made several more attacks, covering his leader. One enemy, spotting him, tried to force a close fight. Aleksei led him upward toward the sun, and when the enemy lost sight of him, he rolled and fired a short, accurate burst. The German plane went down. After landing, mechanics surrounded the machine, checking for damage. There were several bullet holes in the fuselage, but nothing serious. Aleksei climbed from the cockpit, removed his helmet, and smiled. It was his first fight back, and he had proven to himself he could battle just as before. Then came the daily flights: reconnaissance, bomber escort, intercepting enemy aircraft. He was back in the rhythm of frontline aviation: short orders, takeoff, battle, return. Each sortie tested not only the aircraft, but his endurance. Rumors of his return spread further. Pilots from neighboring units came to see him, exchange a few words, shake his hand. For many, he became a symbol that the impossible was possible. In one fight, he downed 2 enemy aircraft. It was in December, under a heavy gray sky full of snow and smoke. That day when he returned, the unit commander said that such pilots were as important to the front as new machines. For Aleksei, the greatest reward was being back in the air, back in the fight, back in service. The prosthetics no longer felt foreign. They were tools, and the true strength had always lived in his hands, his heart, and his desire to fly. In the winter of 1942 and early 1943, Aleksei Maresyev's name began to spread beyond his aviation unit. At first, neighboring squadrons spoke of him. Then stories about the legless pilot reached the Army headquarters. Officers told his story as an example for young soldiers, and frontline newspapers began publishing notes about the unusual aviator. For Aleksei himself, this was unexpected. He did not seek fame and did not consider his actions anything special. In his view, he was simply doing his duty. But in a country at war, losing thousands of people daily, the example of a man who returned to service after such wounds became a symbol that spirit is stronger than flesh. By late winter, a war correspondent arrived at the unit. He spent hours questioning Maresyev about his journey, recording every detail, from the moment his plane went down to his first battle on prosthetics. Aleksei spoke plainly, avoiding grand words. He did not dwell on pain or fear. He spoke of how he could not allow himself to remain on the sidelines while his comrades kept fighting. The article appeared in a central newspaper. It was read at the front and in the rear, in hospitals and factory workshops. Letters began arriving at the unit by the dozen. School children, workers, wounded soldiers wrote. Some asked to pass on their thanks, others asked for advice on how not to give up. Aleksei answered each letter, though he had little time. The command decided to recommend him for an award. He received the Order of the Red Banner. At the ceremonial formation, the commander said the award was not only for downed aircraft, but for the strength of spirit that inspired an entire army. Aleksei stood in the ranks, holding the document, thinking that the true reward for him would always be the chance to take off again. Soon, he was invited to Moscow. It was a rare chance to leave the front and see the capital, which he had not visited since the start of the war. The city greeted him with lights, street noise, and strict wartime discipline. In the capital, he met other heroes of the front, participated in a radio broadcast where he told his story. Millions heard his voice, but fame did not change his approach to the job. Returning to his unit, he again took the cockpit, again flew missions. For him, this was natural. He was a pilot, and his place was in the sky. Each month, the war moved closer to a turning point. In the units, they increasingly spoke of Red Army victories. And though long battles lay ahead, Aleksei saw that his efforts were not in vain. He knew that each flight, each downed enemy wing, brought the end of the terrible war closer. And wherever he was, in Moscow, on the airfield, or in a dugout between sorties. He remained the same man who had once crawled through snow and forest, clinging to life. Only now, he clung to the sky. Victory in May of 1945 found Aleksei still in active service. The war did not end suddenly, but like a slow sunrise after a long, dark night. First came the news of Berlin's capture, then Germany's surrender. In the unit, they held a small gathering, but the joy was restrained. Everyone thought of those who had not lived to see the day. Like many veterans, Aleksei did not immediately realize that his life would now change. Instead of combat sorties, routine flights instead of missions, ferrying aircraft, inspection flights. The habit of living on the edge faded slowly. After demobilization, he stayed in aviation, now as an instructor. He passed on his experience to young pilots, teaching them not only technique, but discipline. He said that in the air, victory goes not to the physically strongest, but to the one who can think faster than the enemy. He was respected for his frontline past and for never putting himself above others. In the late 40s, he graduated from the Zhukovsky Air Force Academy. Studies were not easy. He had to combine classes with regular medical procedures. But his habit of working to the limit helped him here as well. The academy gave him new knowledge and, most importantly, the ability to stay in his beloved profession. In the 1950s, Aleksei began working in the central administration of the Air Force. He participated in developing pilot training programs, oversaw flight schools. Young cadets often came to his office to hear stories of the front. Not to inspire awe, but to explain the price of every mistake in the air. In these years, his name became widely known in civilian life. Books were written about him, films were made, meetings with veterans and schoolchildren were held. Writer Boris Polovoy created the novel The Story of a Real Man, inspired by Maresyev's feat. Aleksei treated it with restraint. He said the book was a work of fiction and there was invention in it. But if it helped people believe in themselves, it was worth it. In his personal life, he was modest. He lived in an ordinary Moscow apartment, often went to his dacha, loved working in the garden. The prosthetics had long become part of his everyday life, and he did not let them limit his plans. In summer he swam, in winter he skied, surprising neighbors and friends. In the 1960s, he became active in veteran organizations. He spoke in schools, at factories, in military units. He talked not only about the war, but about the importance of not giving up when it seems all is lost. People listened closely. He spoke simply, but every word was backed by his life. By the 1970s, he was a living legend. The state honored him with awards, invited him to parades and ceremonies. But he himself believed the main thing was not the medals, but that he remained useful to the cause and to people. When his health began to decline, he did not withdraw. He continued to receive visitors, answer letters, and support young pilots. His life after the war was filled with work, meaning, and the same stubbornness that once helped him crawl through snow and forest. In the last decades of his life, Aleksei Maresyev stayed at home more often. His health, already scarred by the war, reminded him more sharply with each passing year. Old wounds ached in cold weather, his prosthetics required constant care, and every morning began with long exercises without which he could not move. He still met with young people, but traveled the country less often. Invitations came from cities far and near. Schools, military academies, factory collectives asked him to speak about the war. He would reply that he would come if his health allowed. And even when doctors advised him to stay home, he found the strength to face people. By the late 1980s, the country had changed. The familiar system collapsed. The streets grew restless. the air filled with uncertainty. But for those who knew Maresyev, he remained a symbol of endurance. People approached him in the street, recognized him, thanked him. His feat required no political coloring. It stood above that. In the 1990s, he rarely appeared in public. He had strength only to receive visitors and answer letters. But even then, he remained cheerful in conversation, ready to joke, telling stories from his youth. He kept the memory of the war in vivid detail, and when he spoke of his comrades, his voice grew especially quiet. In April 2001, he passed away. The news of Maresyev's death spread across the country. Newspapers, radio, and television told of his life and of the feat that had become legend. Hundreds came to his funeral: soldiers, veterans, school children, ordinary Muscovites. In the procession were many young pilots. They said they came to honor not just a hero, but a true teacher, even if only from afar. His memory lives on not only in books and films. Streets, schools, and aviation clubs bear his name. Museums keep his personal belongings, letters, photographs. But above all, his story is passed from mouth to mouth. For some, it is an example of courage. For others, a lesson that the impossible can be made possible. And today, even when the world seems changed, Maresyev's feat still speaks. It reminds us that a person's strength is not in what they have, but in what they are ready to do for others. His journey, from falling in the forest to victorious battles on prosthetics, is not just a biography. It is proof that the spirit is stronger than any obstacle. And perhaps someday, someone reading or hearing his story will say, just as he once did, "I will not give up." Final of the video, and so ends the story of Aleksei Petrovich Maresyev, a man who lost his legs, but never lost the sky, who walked through snow and forest until his heart beat out the last meter of the path, who proved that victory begins not with an order or a shot, but with an inner decision.